separation between church and state, they told me. I said, all right, let's forget about that for one time. We said, really, the separation? I don't know. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure. But whether there's separation or not, you guys are in the White House where you should be, and you're representing our country, and we're bringing religion back to our country, and it's a big deal.
This is President Trump at the White House in May, questioning the Constitution's separation of church and state implied in the First Amendment. That is, he signed an executive order establishing a presidential commission on religious liberty. Today, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth making headlines after he reposted a video about a Christian nationalist church that includes pastors saying women should no longer be allowed to vote. All of it prompting our next guest to sound the alarm on the blurring of the line between religion and our politics, arguing in a new book that the separation of church and state is under attack as never before. Joining us now, author and professor of religion at Dartmouth College, Randall Balmer. His new book is titled America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. Randall also is an Episcopal priest. Randall, good morning. Thanks for being on the show this morning. So I think it's worth reminding people where this idea comes from. I mentioned the First Amendment. It does not explicitly say separation of church and state. We know Thomas Jefferson wrote that, though, explicitly in a letter a few years later to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, if I'm remembering my high school history correctly. So talk about why this is such an important concept and why you see it fading in this moment.
Well, I think it was an utterly new idea to configure a new nation without the interlocking support of religion or established religion. And it was very important for the founders to recognize that this was the way to do it, to avoid a lot of the religious contestation that had been characterized by religion and politics in Europe. The wars of religion in France, for example, the English Revolution. The founders were well aware of this. And they also had to deal with the extraordinary religious diversity in the colonies, everywhere from the Puritans in New England, the Dutch Reformed in the Middle Colonies, Quakers, Presbyterians, Baptists, you go on, Jews after 1654 in New Amsterdam. And they came up with a novel idea to keep these two entities separate. And that, I think, is part of the genius of American life. And what I find so compelling about the First Amendment, which, as you know, I think is America's best idea, is that it's worked remarkably well for more than 2 centuries. That is to say, it has shielded the government from religious contestation and factionalism, and at the same time, it has ensured a vibrant, salubrious religious culture in America that is really unmatched anywhere in the world.
So, Randall, in the preface for your book, you focus on the high stakes here, and you write in part this: the First Amendment has been resilient over the years, over the decades, but that does not mean that its future is secure. Those who believe in the separation of church and state must continue to patrol that wall of separation. Some on the left argue that voices of faith have no place in the arena of public discourse, while those on the right don the mantle of victim, insist that the United States is a Christian nation, and engage in rhetorical kabuki to assert that the First Amendment does not mandate the separation of church and state. Both positions represent misunderstandings of the First Amendment. The long sweep of American history amply demonstrates the genius of the First Amendment, this grand experiment of constructing a government without the interlocking apparatus of an established religion. Well said, Randall. Talk to us more about what you see, though, as danger signs creeping in here, that those are looking to erode that separation.
Well, obviously, the whole Christian nationalist movement is trying to rewrite American history. We have various people running around claiming, for example, that something like 53 of the 55 founders were evangelical Christians, which is so ludicrous that it's not even worth addressing. And they ignore, as we talked about earlier, the Danbury letter when Jefferson, who was one of the founders, by the way, and said this was his understanding of the meaning of the First Amendment, that it called for the separation of church and state. But you also have the Treaty of Tripoli, for example, that was negotiated at the end of George Washington's administration, that said in Article 11, as the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. This was sent to Congress for ratification by John Adams in 1797, read aloud before the Senate, and ratified unanimously by the United States Senate. That's pretty clear evidence that this is what the founders intended. And now you have various people who are trying to suggest that America was and always has been a Christian nation, should remain so, and that flies utterly in the face of the First Amendment. Now, there have been various attempts throughout American history to amend the Constitution to add all sorts of Christian language to it. But fortunately, at least until this point, we've been able to turn those efforts back.
So, Professor, in this AI TikTok culture that we live in, could you talk a bit about the genius involved between Madison and Jefferson and 16 words, basically 16 words? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exposure thereof.
Free exercise, yes.
About 16 words. The level of genius. Was there any conflict with writing this amendment, with the meaning of this amendment, with the passage of this amendment?
Well, it was ratified by the states by 1791 as the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, and so it had clear support from a majority of the founders. Now, there are a couple of founders who probably wanted to go a little bit further in terms of designating Christianity as the established religion, and that showdown really occurred in Virginia. And that's when Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia, proposed legislation before the Assembly that would have designated generic Christianity, not, for example, Presbyterian or Baptist or Anglican, but simply generic Christianity. And that bill was headed for passage. But James Madison understood the perils of that. He was able to delay vote on that until he published his memorial and remonstrance, arguing for the utility of keeping these two entities separate. The bill was defeated, and then, of course, you have the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom that followed thereafter, drafted by Thomas Jefferson.
The new book is entitled America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. It's available right now. Author and professor of religion at Dartmouth College, Randall Balmer, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning. We appreciate it.